when I first moved here, I moved here from Arizona, but I grew up in Texas and kind of grew up with this belief of Robert E. Lee's superiority and generalship and basically character. Lee was the marble man, and Ulysses Grant was the drunken butcher. That's kind of how I grew up. It's the War of Northern Aggression. It was about states' rights, not about slavery. And then, of course, as I became more educated, I dismissed that belief and really I see Robert E. Lee as kind of a traitor. Well, he is a traitor. And so when I went to play softball my first year here in Lowell, I drove down the street and there's this boat called the Robert E. Lee in the middle of Michigan. And so I was just kind of stunned that there would be a boat named after this guy in the middle of Michigan. And I've been living with Robert E. Lee my whole life. I was hoping that would be one of the benefits of moving to Michigan, was get away from him somewhat. But so I thought I was going to get away from that. I drove down there. I saw this boat sitting in the middle of a river, and I was kind of stunned. And just over the years of being here, I kept asking about it. And I teach classes at Aquinas. I know Matthew does as well. The Emeritus School, or OLLI, it's called OLLI at Aquinas, but it's basically for elderly people that want to learn more about almost any kind of thing you can imagine. And I was teaching a class, and I asked, well, it was actually on Robert E. Lee and Ulysses Grant, and I was talking about that showboat, and a couple of Lowell residents, one whose father was actually an endman or a minstrel on the boat, and a woman that still lived there. The three of us had a long conversation about it afterwards, and I'd never known about the showboat or any of that stuff until we got to talking, and I said, well, this is a great story. Y'all want to help me out? And so these two residents of Lowell and I all went to the archives at the Lowell Historical Society, which has done a fantastic job preserving the history of the boat. And so we dug through there for, 3 or 4 different times. We went over there for 5 or 6 hours and dug through all the articles, and they helped out some. And I put it together, but I don't know enough about Michigan history. I'm a Civil War historian. I know very little about Michigan history, honestly. So I talked to Matthew, and I know Matthew's actually, he said there was another boat on the Chesaning showboat, and I know he's the wonk on Michigan history. So I invited him to join, and I'm glad he did. And so that's kind of how it got rolling, if that's not too long a story. Honestly, I don't really know. I don't. I did go to a couple Lowell Historical Association fundraisers and actually did contribute to the Lowell Historical Association. And there were a few Confederate flags on the trucks out in the parking lot. But other than that, I really honestly don't know. That people knew about it. And the Lowell Showboat, as hopefully the article explains, was a really big deal for a long time in West Michigan. And so one of the guys in the article, I can't draw a blank on his name, but he was the one that basically supported it for years, and they gathered at his house before the actual show. So I think the Historical Society tries to get the word out, but Lowell's a pretty spread out place, and I'm not sure that a lot of people know about it, honestly, the history of it. The lost causes mentality that the South was right, and it was written by historians for a long time. The war was not about slavery; it was about states' rights, and the Confederacy was put upon by the industrial North, and they really pushed for people like Robert E. Lee to be glorified. And so Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, the whole Monument Avenue in Richmond, which is still the most visited tourist destination in Richmond today. And most of these statues, you look at almost all of them, they're put up in like the early 20th century and into the 20s, right when Jim Crow is starting its rise in the South, when Jim Crow starts to rise in the South and African Americans are put under a different kind of heel, not the slavery heel, but definitely the racist discrimination heel. And almost invariably, all those statues are there. And how did it spread to the North is a good question.
Yeah, the South for the lost cause mythos is also going to really manifest itself. Starting in the 1870s, there's going to be a massive financial depression in the 1870s. The Civil War in the North means that the idea of the agricultural sort of heartland and this sort of farms has really been transformed into industrialization. And there's a really devastating financial depression, and not just a recession, but a full-on depression. There is labor unrest, the first national labor strikes. Industrialization really picks up speed. The war enhances it. And what many Northerners look out is they look from, instead of their sort of pre-war small farm, small town, very similar to what they'd experienced pretty much since the start of the 19th century, had pretty radically changed. And there was a lot of discontent going into the 1880s. It's an era of what's called the Long Depression, where the highs get really high and the lows get really low. And so you have wonderful creations, and it really destabilizes much of the North. And the South really sort of decides, in many cases, continues in that sort of agricultural mode. And what it ends up in is that there is a conscious effort by, at that time, Confederate veterans, sympathizers too, and their Northern sympathizers too, because that's the thing we want to keep in mind, is that not everybody in the North was on board with the Union cause, that has presented itself sort of mawkishly as this land that still has tradition, a hierarchy, a structure. The North has waves of immigrants that also challenges the traditional sort of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant hierarchy that had pretty much existed for most of the 19th century. So you begin to have this sort of nostalgia kick in for the North that looks at the South as moonlight and magnolias to that degree. In the South as well, Jim Crow begins to really start to bite in the 1880s. And from 1890 around 1920 is usually called the nadir, about as low as race relations ever get, with extreme vigilante violence and brutality that abates only slightly. We have to be careful of that. And there's a real sense in the North that that what did you get out of the Civil War? You got an industrialized, capitalist, very go society. Everything picks up speed. And it really is disconcerting, and it really doesn't tell you where your place is or how it works. And the South starts to look very good in comparison. And I would also point out too, there's another component that lets it spread. The Union Army's veterans group is called the Grand Army of the Republic. And it's similar in a way to prohibition, national prohibition of alcohol. The Union Army veterans, for whatever reason they fought, be it for abolitionist causes, for adventure, whatever, they view their work as done. They won the military struggle, the South surrendered, and you go home. Your victory is self-evident. The South does not view it, as Scott mentioned, does not view it as a settled matter, and really does portray that sort of idea. There's also an effort among veterans and also among political leaders, particularly in the 1876 election, another sort of creepy parallel to today, really wants to push reconciliation, that we are one nation again, and we're going to do all that. And that's going to be another powerful image, that the Confederate veterans do not accept that as a settled matter. The North is very eager to sort of reunite. By 1913, the 50th anniversary of Gettysburg, we see that Ken Burns had it in his Civil War video. That sort of, we are all one nation, we're all reconciled, and there are no African-American veterans. There's no discussion of that. And it really does sort of have a multi-pronged effect in the North, both in cultural sense, that this is a place that still moves by the old rhythms, which leaves out quite a bit. It's an idea of reconciliation across the North, that we are one nation. And then also, it's also important to remember, and the last point is that even up until the 1900, 90% of all African Americans lived south of the Ohio River. So in many parts of the North, you had very little contact with African Americans, and it really wasn't part of your everyday life, and that allows stereotypes, expectations to really sort of linger without a sort of a direct connection to that regard, and that really helps to spread that sort of idea of moonlight and magnolias in the North. And that's also pop culture, which I'll address in a moment.
This still exists in the South. I don't know if you can see that, but it says, erected to the memory of the heroes. This is in Louisiana, Stephen Decatur Perry, yada, 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 who fell in the Colfax riot fighting for white supremacy. And this is a monument in support of those people. And so that's that's the mentality of a lost cause. But then I grew up, this is my fraternity's was actual Rush pamphlet. That's the year I pledged. And so you can obviously see there's some lost cause mentality in this.
When we want to think about how that sort of becomes a part of it, excuse me, when we think about how that becomes a part of cultural life in Lowell, it helps to understand pop culture, where that comes from. One thing to keep in mind is that the idea of Jim Crow, and Scott mentioned it, of Jim Crow segregation refers to a minstrel character put together in the 1830s in the North for performers, and it was a caricature of African Americans. The song went, "I turn around and jump around and do just so, and every turn around to jump Jim Crow." And it was a white performer who darkened his face, exaggerated features, and performed in sort of what he would define as African American style, which was patently his invention. And that became a very popular stage performance for that particular actor. It caught on. And it will be very much based in racially sort of structured music and entertainment. And what it will also do is it will also pull in African Americans by the 1850s and 60s. If you wish to have access to the performing stage, African American performers would have to conform to this expectation. White audiences loved it. It was very popular. It combined, and a minstrel would be sort of song and dance and a particular type of music, sort of a very stylized version. That will also be spread through showboats, which were sort of traveling venues on the Ohio and tributary rivers, some of them with integrated casts, which all performed this sort of very racially stereotyped music in the 19th century. And it was wildly popular. In fact, there was also the rise of sheet music. And so sheet music would spread everywhere. And this is also very, very racially, today, essentially, if you say certain words and so forth that are viewed as unacceptable, these are going to be trafficked just openly, and there's no point. In fact, my students have been shocked and said, "Are you trying to shock us?" And my response is, "No. This is, if you want to know how far it goes, it was completely socially acceptable among white communities. And in fact, some of the most popular songs were written by African Americans, because if you wanted to have access to it, you did that. Even Scott Joplin got pulled into that sort of system. So the power of that popularity could not be denied, and it is national. Tin Pan Alley, one of the things is that not only did they create, Irving Berlin, they also created a range of songs that would be shocking to our ear today. And that is popular from the 1830s well into the 19 teens. It will decline a little bit after the First World War, but then it will also pick up speed again with the publication in the 1920s of Edna Ferber's Showboat, about a white family of performers who do so in blackface and wish to leave it behind and become more acceptable performers. You would think that's sort of enlightened. If you read the novel, one, it's not great, and two, it's not very enlightened. And in 1929, there was the film Showboat, which was one of the first sort of sound films that did splice sound and sort of spoken word together. It was actually made before the advent of that. 1927 also saw that resurgence in interest with the Al Jolson film, The Jazz Singer, a Jewish musician who plays a sort of stereotyped African-American music. The class is in blackface, and it was the first sound film. And so it is a fascinating sort of portrait of both of ethnic and racial stereotypes all at once in one film. And so that regains power. And then there's going to be another film of Showboat in 1936, which will be the one that most people remember, and also a musical as well. So in the early 1930s. So these are part of pop culture. And it's not just Lowell per se, it's everywhere. In fact, in the Lowell Area Historical Museum, there is a booklet that was published in the 19 teens about how to create your minstrel show, with all the things. And I've had a chance to look at it. It's terrifying to its extent of how you would apply the makeup, the style, the dialect, the dance routines. And it's published nationally, and you could actually buy a kit. They sold kits for it. So again, it's a very powerful piece. Another thing to keep in mind too, and the Jim Crow Museum at Ferris State also has a huge amount of this material, is the level of racial stereotyping that is a part of all sorts of product. But you can have it not only for Aunt Jemima's syrup and Uncle Ben's, which I'm startled they've managed to survive until recently, but on almost everything. The sheer number of everything from domestic salt and pepper shakers all the way up to artwork is jarring to really think about it. And so it's very much ingrained in cultural expectations, not only in the South, but in the North. And that really brings that sort of expectation to where that sort of expectation of mockery is not just for one place, it's just the deal. And I think that's the hardest part to get our minds around, is that is so ingrained. You would need to tell chunks of American society that it was unacceptable. And especially when you have so little experience. Michigan is an odd state because, unlike Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, which border on Kentucky and had a great deal of back and forth between communities, and what in fact Southern Ohio is referred to as the butternut belt. What you have communities that are very diverse. If you, I taught briefly at Ohio University, and if you drive through that part of Southern Ohio, it's far more diverse than you would expect for what is ostensibly a northern state. But Michigan only really got a large African-American population with the rise of industrialization. And that drew families primarily to major industrial cities, such as Kalamazoo, Pontiac, Detroit, obviously, Saginaw, Flint. And it really has left the state's population largely skewed, even though in the southern two tiers of county, there are far more integrated communities than we might expect. But the further north you go, the less diversity appears very quickly. And that has remained a very durable phenomena well into the 21st century. So the combination of music, commercial operation, and for Lowell, the only African Americans when I was doing the census, and that was a major question, was were there African Americans in the area? And I thought, well, that's a great question. So I went through the census, including all the way to the 19th century, where there were off-year censuses, and simply they would one or two families would appear and then not be there the next. And what threw me off was it borders Ionia County, and Ionia County had a rather substantial African American population. And when I first was looking at it for a little bit, I thought, well, how is that working? And then I thought, oh wait, there's Ionia. It was the prison population that was counted in their census. So in many cases, Grand Rapids had a very small African American population, as historians Randall Jelks and Todd Robinson have noted, which meant that it was so small as were many parts of the city's own residents would have very little contact with African Americans, that they're simply not a visible part of that and could be easily not paid attention to, despite the long term. And African Americans have been in Grand Rapids area for a very long time, before frankly, before Michigan became even a state. But that is sort of the piece. Lowell is not alone. In fact, Lowell, in the article, one of the things that I wanted to argue, and I'm glad Scott agreed with me, was that Lowell really isn't all that special. It's actually quite common for Michigan. I mean, frankly, if you've been to Lowell, you've been to Sandusky, you've been to Clare, you've been to Fremont, you've been to a range of places that are all, ironically, they're all on rivers. They all have little boat things. They all have little festivals, and they're perfectly interesting little towns. But what made Lowell particularly interesting is the Showboat, and that they were able to put that together. So Lowell's lack of interaction with African Americans meant that even if African Americans passed through or did some business, they were not permanent residents. And so there is very little interaction to challenge assumptions, to alter those perceptions. Doesn't mean that Lowell participated in overtly racist acts because it was fun prior to the Showboat, probably, but it didn't really show up. It didn't have anything to say that it was especially unusual, which I always sort of tell folks, it explains, it doesn't justify. It's an explanation, it's very typical, and it's typical of hundreds of towns throughout Michigan and the northern part, which our closest compatriot for how our population is sort of spread out is actually Wisconsin. We share a lot in common with Wisconsin. The northwest part of the state is very sparsely populated. Everybody's jammed along the Lake Michigan coast running north from Chicago into Madison. and very much like Michigan, it's a band along I-96. And then once you get to the M46 line and go north, it becomes very, very, very small towns, which was my background. My experience is I was actually pleasantly surprised that the Lowell Historical Museum was willing to actually talk about it. Many communities, and I would like to point this out, over the years, I've worked with different groups to preserve some forms of Ku Klux Klan memorabilia, which sounds strange to say, but oftentimes when families discover these sorts of things, they immediately either throw them in a burn pile and destroy it because no one wants to know that grandpa was a member of the Klan. But what it means is that it wasn't because I wished it to venerate it. It is to ensure that there's a physical reminder that it should go to a museum, that this did exist, that it can't just be thrown down a memory hole and denied that that's a part of it. Some communities have found that there are large collections of Klan membership cards, which are really troubling to those groups. And in fact, they've been given to archival centers to both provide access and also because many local institutions face such pressure to dispose of them because no one wants to do that because of what that piece is, not because of enlightenment, primarily because of the fear of what that says about a community. For Lowell itself, there has been over the years, both before we've done this, and I've had a little bit of that in my time. I was asked to talk a little bit about it with a group. Is that the Showboat was so popular and it was so ingrained into the city. It brought money for city development. It brought a host of resources to that. And it was not just a small town show. And that's an important thing. It reached a regional audience. I found advertisements as far away as Minneapolis, as far south as Louisville, all the way out into Albany, New York, that this was a big draw. Even in the Chicago Tribune featured advertisements every year. The West Michigan Tourism Bureau featured it. This was a really big component, and that it also was a combination of national performers and also the N-men, who were both a mixture of professionals and local community members, as Scott mentioned earlier. So there's a lot of buy-in to this. This isn't like the carnival that comes in, you have the carnival, they pack up and they go home. Surprise, the carnival is you. And that really ingrained it. And that people, in many ways, I sometimes suspect that in my own family, the answer sometimes came up was to say, it was okay to think it, it wasn't okay to say it. That's what other people did. And so there's a weird disjuncture for many people's minds between what you could say or what you could do. And you can see that sometimes the defensiveness comes, I suspect in part, because they realize that this probably isn't going to fly anymore. But at a certain point, as we found in the article, and reading, and incidentally, much of the information came from the newspaper, there was already at least some conversation about how does this go on as early as the early 1960s, that people began to feel like, should we go on with this? Is this acceptable? And what we found was, the answer was yes, we're going to go forward. It was a conscious choice. It didn't just happen, or oops, we didn't know. They had eaten of the tree of knowledge and proceeded forward. In my experience, many people wish to tell me, well, my family didn't know. It was back in the day. We didn't understand. We didn't know. And that clashes with what the conversations that took place in the newspaper, in public. I would emphasize, if you read the Lowell Ledger, which is digitized, you can read letters to the editor, conversations. These are not secret discussions. The discussions that were perhaps less public were done by the committee that ran it. But even today, there's a lot of disjuncture. I think partly it reflects the political split in our sense of political correctness, that no one's going to take it away. And what was a long time ago, and we don't do that anymore. And we're really sorry. We don't say it, but probably we think it, perhaps. And so my experience has been that there has been some jarring senses and efforts to justify it. And as I've tried to explain to people, and I've had a few people who've been confused and felt like, are you justifying? And my answer is no. We're trying to explain that this is a part of that sort of identity. And it does fit into its time. But frankly, because of those public discussions, That is how I have sort of responded to resistance, is to say, this isn't a secret. This isn't public. Your forebears did talk about this, and there was a conscious choice. It was not just, oops, we didn't know. Much like the Lost Cause, people didn't come to love that sort of image of Robert E. Lee just out of the goodness of their heart in America. I would argue to you, and I would add to Scott's earlier point, the Lost Cause is perhaps the greatest advertising / propaganda campaign in American history, and it's stunningly successful. I will tell you, my own experience was, when I was a young person, I kind of felt like, so the South won the Civil War. And I had a teacher get very angry with me. And I said, I don't know. Everybody's got a Confederate flag. We talk about Robert E. Lee all the time, all the way up here in the land of the Enchanted Mitten. I thought they lost the war. And so I've had many students that have also said, well, I kind of feel like the South won the war. They got their way, didn't they? And I always kind of smiled and said, but that's a tradition as well. And that's an uncomfortable concept. And I think that's the resistance, is it's jarring to be confronted with that. But I've had very few people write me or speak to me, especially aggressive. I think maybe it's because I'm from Michigan that kind of helps. And I always kind of tell folks, if you're uncomfortable, guess what? Where I grew up, we had no conversations about diversity or race at all. And I think that also is sort of the thing that does that. Scott, what do you think?
As far as Lowell residents, I have had no resistance whatsoever. In fact, they've been in, as Matthew said, the Lowell Historical Society or Historical Museum, which I think encompasses it all, has been very supportive. Lowell residents I haven't heard anything negative. Now, granted, I've talked to probably a dozen at most, so it's not anything extraordinary. And the article I haven't read. Have you read the comments, Matthew, or are there any feedback in the editorial letters after the article was published?
No, there were no editorial pushback to it at all. In fact, it was a sort of a discussion more about what else went on. Someone asked, I did get asked about the Chesaning Showboat, which did do a similar venue, but they got rid of their sort of Southern theme pretty early on. It was like one thing to keep in mind too, for more context, is that in the late 1940s was the Disney film put forward a mixture of live action and cartoon, which was Song of the South, for which on many children's CDs today, Zippity Doo Dah, the song exists, but the film is not accessible. And so I sort of find that's the only film that's been banned because it also trafficked in that. And sort of the use of minstrel, I think also what makes Lowell's sort of struggle with it is that it went on for so long, well into the 1970s, when that sort of public, large, regionally advertised show with national performers both had kind of started to die out, as much as Lowell eventually did, but also that, like, Hollywood had sort of turned away. When I was looking through IMDb, the Internet Movie Database, I found that a lot of that sort of stuff really petered out by around 1954, 1955. It just sort of like vanished. And I'm not sure if it was because of any sort of racial sensitivity, but certainly it sort of, my suspicion was it like the Hollywood musical. It was just simply past its sell-by date at that point and was no longer popular, the dollars rather than sensibilities. But it really does touch on that sense that for today's resistance, in some ways, I would be more suspicious if it doesn't speak more to political divisions currently existing, rather than a real love of the Showboat's entity. The Showboat, as people would remember it, is now, 43 years in the past. I mean, that's many, many years ago, and very few, an increasingly small number of people are going to remember that. And in fact, I had one person I spoke to at an Ollie event said, I went to see it, around the time it was going away, and we didn't go after about 1970 because it wasn't very good. That it had really lost a lot of that sort of steam. Because again, it also reminds us, and we wrote in the article, was that it had sort of run out of gas at that point. It was competing with national, remember, until the Beatles in the mid 1960s, there were no sort of like large national events that you would go to an arena and go see something play. It's a new entertainment, and television and so forth had really taken a bite out of that event, and it got smaller every year. And also that the Showboat's organizers, if you look at the shows, and another thing When I've had even the smallest amount of resistance, I've pushed back and said, well, who did they get? And people go, well, they got Pearl Bailey. I'm like, yeah, they got Pearl Bailey. And I always survey folks. I'm like, how many folks remember Pearl Bailey? They don't remember Pearl Bailey. I remember Pearl Bailey. And many of the acts became smaller and smaller. You didn't get the really big names. And that spoke to the change in pop culture. So in many ways, it even within the Showboat, it became pretty clear reading the materials that their effort to go on with it was a very conscious choice rather than tradition or something along those lines. You can sort of code it in that, and I'm sure there was a degree of it, but it really began to be very clear that the voices against it popped up much louder than had in the past. And so I think Lowell, I think communities don't like to be reminded of it, but it really keeps it from being, I think, romanticized and sort of downplayed. And I think that when there was a debate over the rebuilding of the Showboat recently, that was the bigger piece, was to say maybe it's time for a new name. And that was something that we wanted to emphasize, that it wasn't always what it was. It actually did change. There's been like 5 or 6 boats, and the first ones weren't even named Robert E. Lee. That was another choice. And so there are options available to deal with it and to not hide it, and to deal with it and to come to terms with that phenomena, but not to forget it and not to just dismiss it.
Well, it seems like those are the key years of history in Lowell, right? That's their kind of, they put the Showboat. If you Google Lowell, that's the picture, that the image that shows up on Google is the Showboat. They're historical. If you go get the history of Lowell or the tour of Lowell, you get the Showboat. There's still banners of the Showboat. It's still a very central part of that community, right? And I would add to some of what Matthew said, and really contextualize more what I said. There hasn't been resistance to people I know, but everything has come from the outside, right? Pearl Bailey refused to come unless the Minstrels ended, so they ended the Minstrels. And the Showboat's name, Robert E. Lee name, was taken off of it just recently in the last 4 years, I believe, simply because of outside pressure from state funding, right? They think state funding, that my money, your money, shouldn't be going to support a boat named the Robert E. Lee. Remember, the Showboat had actors, Louis Armstrong, all the way back to the very first. As McKinney Cotton Pickers were very popular, and they're an African-American band, were very popular at the Showboat. It's not like Jim Crow, where you didn't have white people and black people on the same stage, and it was just a different form of entertainment than you would get in the South.
The last performance that still was going to feature, was planned to feature Blackface, was going to be in Minstrels, was in 1977, and that had really sort of come at the end of the restart. Right, it had been gone in 1967, is brought back in the early 1970s, a very conscious choice, and in really ways to push back against the thought that there wasn't any sort of opportunity to sort of close the show down or to do that sort of a better work. And so to that end, what really comes down to that is that it really reflected that perhaps no longer a community. Lowell had started to change by the 1970s with the construction of the Interstate 96. You now had an easier movement back and forth between Lansing and Detroit area to Grand Rapids. Suburbanization had really taken off, so therefore you had new housing developments. If you look at a map of Lowell, maps of Lowell at that time, you can tell how quickly it was starting to grow. You also begin to have more new families coming in who are not necessarily tied. And another interesting piece that sort of jumped out at us was the number of people who had been involved with the Showboat for decades, not just like new people. You had organization that had really become sort of very static. So what you end up with is members who wanted to still do things the same way and were not really keen on having folks change things up. There were no changes in performances. Like you still had Pearl Bailey, a wonderful performer, but that appealed to a particular demographic in the community, one that certainly was not going to be popular with their Led Zeppelin listening children and grandchildren. That certainly wasn't going to fly. And that rock and roll had been explicitly sort of pushed to the margin if it ever showed up. It was definitely a marginal, like, oh, here we did this for the kids. And that's an important thing, is that the showboat didn't change with the times. It didn't sort of evolve. And one of the pieces is that by the time you get to 1977, it took an outside performer to say, no, we're not going to do that. And what I think frustrated showboat organizers was that she had performed earlier with that, and had been viewed much like Louis Armstrong, who had also performed on for many years on that sort of style, that sort of black-faced performers, began to say, no, we're not going to do that. It is no longer acceptable, and did so on a level of principle. And I think that threw off the organizers, that if someone who had been there before, had been an excellent draw, had been willing to perform, was going to say no, maybe it's time for it to be done. And they had a choice. They could either have no national headliner, or they could not have, or they could have, no showboat. And they opted at that point to bend and to have the end men, the blackface minstrels, become sort of Kentucky colonels. You sort of dressed up in a silly costume and you do your thing, but without blackface. And that really brought it down. And what does that say? It really does say in many ways that for many communities, it's if you have sort of an established sense of authority and leadership, that leadership can really carry on and have an impact on communities that we don't really think about. And even if they do bring new members in, oftentimes those members are going to be vetted to sort of support that. I mean, some of the folks who were even younger on the board were also not going to really challenge that. And in small communities and many communities, who wants to be the person who rocks the boat, who really stands out? I think most of us would do anything to avoid a fight and that sort of contentiousness. And it really wasn't that sort of moment at that time, especially in the years that followed the civil rights movement of the 1960s and early 1970s. And so you end up with sort of a change, really be a change agent being an external force, much as in the present day. You needed the circumstances, you needed that push, you needed where the boat in the present day was just in such bad shape, you had to do it, and you have a breaking point. And this too is a breaking point to where there were increasing questions as attendance, as revenue declined, as things had really not gone well in the 70s. It gave it the impetus with Pearl Bailey's refusal to perform on stage with black-faced performers to really break that. But it wasn't really an organic choice by the group that put on the showboat. And in many ways, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, that change is an external force. And that partly is why I think some community members clung to it and sort of have that identification. It was like, we didn't want to get rid of it, those people did. You get a very particular us and them kind of component, which goes to the second part of the question. How does that shape the lack of coverage of this, of opposition? I like to think of it too as also, in one part is, whom do you take seriously, right? You have an outsider in the Grand Rapids press. That's the big city. This is still a rural community, and they're not going to take too kindly to the big city folk telling the community you should give that up. In addition, Grand Rapids' African American community, though it had grown significantly, still remained a smaller part of the overall regional population, and that sort of dynamic has an impact of muting those voices. And even when the press took it seriously, you have the sense within communities, as the historian Todd Robinson at UNLV points out, that at times you don't really push, because the sense is that if that's what they want to do, that's what these folks are going to do. And us showing up there is not necessarily going to get them to stop it. And that there was a sense that there were other fish to fry, to borrow metaphor. Even the city's African American newspaper more or less said almost nothing. And really sort of, when it did mention, it was like, if that's what people want to do, that's what they're going to do, which is sort of an unhappy sense. I found that to be terribly troubling, that there was a sense that we would just be ignored anyway, and it will make our lives worse. To where even in the community, you have people that would write to the Lowell Ledger and its various incarnations. It changed names a number of times, And the sense was is that it was also the problem of what I like to think of as Michigan nice, that we tend to eschew confrontation in many ways, and that this was something that was going to really make you stand out in that regard. And there was a tension between longtime residents and the newcomers, whom owns the community, who has say in that community. Is it a place that's home? And even for the press, not just because they're overtly racist. In fact, there is coverage. Their columnists, white columnists, begin to go, "What is this thing? What a dinosaur!" But it has the impact of still being that us and them sort of sense. Michigan has an interesting relationship with the Ku Klux Klan, particularly the second Klan that emerges in around 1915. The first Klan came immediately in the wake of the Civil War, from about 1868 to about 1871, and will be a primarily Southern sort of a phenomena overall. And it's going to take a number of names. It's not like it's a centralized authority. People should not be confused in that regard. It'll be the Knights of the White Camellia, the Night Riders, and so on and so forth, and the Ku Klux Klan. And in fact, there will be efforts by Congress and President Ulysses Grant to use the military to put down what is viewed as basically a white supremacist terrorist organization, domestic terror, against African Americans and white allies in the wake of the Civil War. The Klan in 1915 is going to be formed out of Atlanta, Georgia. It's going to feature not only sort of the idea of white supremacy, but it actually takes on a broader, perhaps even more insidious role. And it is going to be a centrally created entity that will be a supplier of regalia, of robes. It will look very much like something else that many of us no longer participate in, sort of organizations like the Elks or the Moose or Kiwanis, sort of things with sort of secret rituals, pseudo so much sort of civic groups. And so the Klan, oddly enough, is going to take that sort of piece and role within that time, only with regalia and other sorts of components. If you are in the South, the Klan of around 1915 to say 1925 at its peak will primarily be against African Americans, particularly in the South, below the Ohio River. What gets complicated is in some places, such as El Paso, Texas, there are very few African Americans. And in fact, it is not even against Latinx communities. It really was a moral entity that was angry about the scandalous movies, the jazz music being played. And if you find their interests, it's very interesting. In Buffalo, New York, it is strongly anti-immigrant. African Americans were in there too, but they really disliked immigrant communities. If you go to Portland, Oregon, Portland is a very interesting city. I find the present day discussion of it to be very odd. Portland is the whitest major city in the United States, and it is also has a long, long tradition of class, ethnic, racial, political strife for decades. I find it to be odd that that's never raised. It's sort of an interesting piece of ignoring history. Even the show Portlandia doesn't do a particularly good job of touching on it, which it probably should have. But when we think about it, they will be very interested in both Asian immigration and also hostility towards left-wing labor organizations, as they will in Seattle as well. That's another city that has a huge amount of unrest buried beneath its historical surface. In Michigan, some of the largest claverns of organizations will not be in major cities. In fact, they will be around Big Rapids, Fremont, in other communities, and one of the Grand Haven. And you would say, well, there's no diversity in these places. That's right. Because the second Klan was like a many-headed hydra. It had different interests in different places. In Grand Haven, it mirrored much of the moral panic that we would see: jazz, theaters, baseball on Sunday, the blue laws, commercialized entertainments, clothing, policing gender and identity roles. And in fact, that was some of the work that's been done by historians, because the question is what does the Klan have to do with anything in Big Rapids? The African American community is tiny. And in fact, The extant material about the Klan says nothing about African Americans, but it is all wielded against different power and authority, partly because Ferris State, or at that time, the Ferris Institute, and they were very concerned what those Institute kids were up to. So in many places, you'll find the Second Klan to be a very strange entity. It will exist in Detroit and other cities of the larger cities, and it will have African Americans as a principal focus, and also immigrants as well. And in Detroit in 1925, will wield significant authority in attempting to elect a mayor who runs on a relatively openly white supremacist campaign, and will have a very difficult campaign, and a violent one as well, with vigilante violence. 1925 also sees, even if you don't have hooded men in this sort of affair, in Michigan, there will be an effort to ban parochial schools, notably Catholic schools, using public schools as an entity of Americanization. That will create resistance of an interesting variety, to where you will have an odd mixture of Catholics, various Protestant faiths, and Jewish communities, all resisting the state legislature's effort to ban parochial schools, not because of any sort of unity or sort of ecumenical spirit and faith, but the idea that the Klan had gone maybe a little too far, and that was going to be pushed back against, and the measure will be defeated. One of the things to keep in mind about the Klan is there's a focus on the regalia, which is important and was a key marker. And in fact, in July 1925, the Klan will actually have a large camp. About 3,000 members will be at Lincoln Park on the northwest side of Grand Rapids along Bridge Street. That isn't picked because it was a park. It was picked because it was the heart of the Polish and Lithuanian communities in northwest Grand Rapids, and marched down Bridge Street, down across the river, down Monroe through this heart of downtown Grand Rapids, and then west on Fulton Street to a rally at John Ball Park, again in another ethnically diverse community. This had very little to do with African Americans. It was an effort to try to make Grand Rapids the center of the Klan, the idea that a largely white and Protestant community would support it against Catholics and immigrants. And so when they march and the pictures are shown, they are shocking. But that was targeted to be a deliberate provocation to that community. In fact, you don't do that if you aren't looking for trouble. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. Much was, and very little was said about that. The major newspapers, the Press and the Herald, said almost nothing about this. It was viewed as outsiders trying to tell the heavily Protestant community what to do. And Protestant churches were not real thrilled with that outcome. They viewed it as a challenge to their authority, not because they didn't like the Klan. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, that they marched unmasked, and there was a law to not let them be masked. What's important to keep in mind is popular films like the 1988 film Mississippi Burning creates what one scholar called the image of sweaty rednecks in the dark doing bad things. In fact, the Second Klan featured primarily middle-class participants, those best members of their community. These acts were done in daylight and were large public performances. Cross burnings were kind of like a sideshow. And nor did people need to wear masks. In fact, the Klan's reach in Indiana, and most powerfully in Indiana, but also in Michigan, extended to legislators, again, the best people of the community. And we shouldn't get confused about that idea. The Second Klan is a powerful concept of participation, where people felt very empowered through group participation to express these ideas of varying motifs. This is a very nuanced view of the Klan, and perhaps is against what most people are familiar with, and pop culture does like to present that. But most times, if you saw a Klansman, they would look like much of the white community of the state, and didn't need to have a hood or a robe. That drew attention, but their ideas were oftentimes expressed in broad daylight. So for the Klan in Michigan, one of the things that we wanted to do for the article was, what I was concerned with when I mentioned this to a colleague at another institution. He said, "Oh, did the Klan do it?" And my response was, that's interesting, because again, we like to blame everything on the Klan. It's those people. We didn't do it. It's plausible deniability. And what we found was that from what I could find in the state references and the extant material, There were klaverns in some of the communities around the area, but not necessarily in Lowell. Lowell featured both Protestant and Catholics in the same city, and there had been a fair bit of intermarriage. The Lowell Ledger sort of pointed that out. It was at that time in the 1920s and 1930s still worth noting when that happened, and it was quite a scandal. But at the same time, my suspicion was it didn't mean that there weren't Klan members or people with Klan sympathies. It was that because of this complexity, it was someplace you took your backroom time someplace else. You didn't do it in Lowell at that point. Nor did we find in the minutes and materials of the showboat any real overt references or open discussions, which, considering the level of overt racial statements, would not have been surprising at all. In fact, would have been very helpful. In fact, in their reminiscences and in their documents that they left, and they left quite a surprisingly large amount in detail, not minutes like discussion ensued. Heck, they wrote it down. This is what we talked about. So it was startlingly open, and you can go to the museum and have a look at it. And we didn't find anything. We went, okay. So apparently, if there was that sort of sensibility, it was either unspoken and baked in, or as may well have been the case as well, it may have been a combination of culturally ingrained racial sensibilities, which doesn't excuse that either, but also the sense that this was just acceptable pop culture. It was very popular. If you want to draw a show, what would we do? They do mention listening to radio programs and the popular culture of film and novel. Remember, this is the era of Gone with the Wind. So, my sense is that they brought it in, and that it can't be put off on the Klan or some alien entity. I think it's kind of convenient. You maybe have outsiders tell you can't do it. And I think it would be sort of an interesting twist if they tried to say, oh, the Klan made us do it. They didn't. In fact, they owned it. It was their idea, and they wanted it done their way. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind for the communities, that they owned it in that regard, for better or for worse, mostly for the latter rather than the former. But certainly the Klan is there. But it was not like a large presence. At no point did the newspaper, which newspapers did report on cross burnings and that sort of activity. If there were marches, you had to go into Ionia County or other areas further east or to the south to attend those events. We found very little mention of them in the Lowell area. So it doesn't mean that it wasn't there. It does mean that the showboat can't be just put off on, again, a bunch of sweaty rednecks in the dark. And the people who formed the committee and were a part of it were very much the best people of the community. And when I say best people, I would say the leading businessmen, representatives, community figures, civic authorities, of those sort of people. It wasn't a bunch of people you would say, well, we can't find them. They were people who were there and were open and were proud of their association and for having built the showboat into this regional entertainment venue.